Ah.
What is it, 6 o'clock there?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
6 o'clock, and it's starting to come winter. Benny, if you want to say hello.
Evening, Mr. Caputo. Good evening, fellow classmates. Good evening, Justin.
Good evening. And Lepo Nolo, if you want to say hello.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us, Caputo.
You're quite welcome, Leo. Just call me Jack. Everyone calls me Jack.
Okay, so we've got a slight issue, and I'm apologizing for that, but Jack, we have this thing in South Africa. We all love it. It's called load shedding. And what that is basically, we have one power provider for the entire country. And on occasion, they just decide to black out certain cities or certain areas to either save money or to, there's just too much power going on. So we do have some students who won't be able to join us because of it. So do you mind if we record this?
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay, great. Yeah, and if some students come in after the fact or something like that, that's probably because they're on their cell phone and using their data. So, you know, we'll just be patient with that and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can plan a pretty picnic, but you can't predict the weather.
Yeah. Life is what happens when you had other plans.
Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started real quickly. You can see my screen, and you don't really have to look at it, guys, but I do have a little PowerPoint just to keep us in order. But again, it's just there. Jack and I, we talked about the format to begin with. We're going to open the floor just a little bit later, but I sent him some of your questions in advance, and he thought that this was one of the questions that might be a good platform for us to start our discussion. So I'm going to read it out loud here, and apologies for my poor reading skills out loud, but it's on general metaphysics. Whether we talk about God as the highest being or use apophatic descriptive language based on this radical paradigm of the depth of God, are we not perpetuating the same folly in the highest being to now deepest God? In both instances, we're still locating God. Am I the revelation? Could the revelation granted to Moses of God's name in Exodus 3:14, I am who am? Who I am, can that be the proper point of departure on the reflection of God? If so, then perhaps the emphasis would be on God's own self-disclosure of God's self, whether high or deep or whatever or wherever. Caputo makes a lot of noise on the infiniteness of God, but wherever one locates God on, say, an infinite thread or spectrum or timeline, which has a horizon we cannot observe or perceive, one still delimits to God their knowledge and description of God. If so, then we can only know or discuss revealed elements that fall on this infinite thread, spectrum, or timeline, which may seem like we're delimiting the unlimited, yet in reality there is no way of capturing it all. I feel Psalm 90 may capture this point. Now, if you're the one who presented this question, feel free to jump in and clarify if you'd like, or carry on a conversation. But Jack, if you would like, you can have the floor to answer their first question tonight.
Yeah, I appreciate the question because it gives me an opportunity to frame out what I want to say. I mean, I think my general schematism is there. I use in the folly of God. I take my point of departure from Tillich, who was making a comeback. Tillich was a big star when I was a young man and a graduate student, and then he sort of disappeared. And but in the last 10, 15 years, you've got what a lot of young people are calling the radical Tillich making a comeback. And I think the way to put what I want to say is what I call weak theology or theopoetics or radical theology is this. It's a movement that begins with the classical theistic the theology of the ens supremum, of the supreme being, which is the God that we all grew up with. It's the God that, I learned from my parents and from the nuns and from the priests and from Cecil B. DeMille and the movies. And that's what God means for the most part when we use the name of God. That's classical theology as opposed to radical theology. That's theism, classical theism, and its most elaborate and brilliant exposition is found in Thomas Aquinas, I would say. I am making a movement, or you could call it in phenomenology a reduction, from that God, whom I take to be true in a broad and symbolic sense, from that God to first in two steps. I'm making a two-step movement. First, a reduction of the God of classical theology or theism to the ground of being, as in Tillich. And ultimately, as in Hegel and Schelling, because that's where that's coming from. That stuff is coming from. With Tillich, I am saying God is not a being, not even the highest being, not even the supreme being, but the ground of being. God is not a discrete thing. God is the ground of things. God is not a person or even three of them. God is the ground of persons. God is that in which we live and move and have our being. As Luke has Paul say at the Areopagus. God is if we were fish, God would be the water. If we were birds, God would be the air. God is the element of our being, the ground of our being. And when we speak about God as a particular somebody, that's a personification. That's not false. It's just not the whole truth. It's still, as Heidegger would say, still in the state of untruth. Its deeper truth hasn't been worked out yet. And the first step in working out its deeper truth is the pantheistic position that God is in all are in God. God is all in all. That in which we live and move, have be not a discrete person. So when we speak to God, something's getting itself said and done. We're making contact with reality. We're making contact with something that's there. We're not simply fantasizing. We're in touch with the ground of being. Okay? Now, that for a lot of people, so we've moved from being to becoming, we've moved from substance to process, that whole pantheistic movement. My second move is to move from the ground of being to something that I consider to be even more unconditional than the ground of being, and that is what I'm calling the event. The event is not a being, it's not even the ground of being. It is, so how should we then describe it? Well, you might want to say, well, it's without being, or it's beyond being. And then you'd be into sort of a classical Neoplatonic way of thinking about it. I would say the event means the possibility of being otherwise, so that the present is broken up by the prospect of the possible and by the retrospect of what has been all along from time immemorial. So the event has to do with the breakup of being, the breakup of presence, the breakup of ontology and classical theology, of ontotheology, which pries the present open with the hope or the prospect or the expectation of the possible, of the possibility of the impossible. With God, all things are possible, even the impossible. God is the possibility of the impossible. God is the prospect, the hope, the love of what is coming. And the figure this takes in the New Testament is of the coming of the kingdom. The kingdom does not exist, the kingdom calls. When we call for the kingdom, we are responding to the call that the kingdom makes. The kingdom calls for us, and we respond. So the event is not a being, not the ground of beings. It is a hope and expectation and a memory from time immemorial of something of which we are dreaming, hoping, desiring, praying, something we love. The event is not what happens. The event is what is going on in what happens. What is getting said and done, what we are dreaming of, what we are praying for, what we are hoping for, what we love. Okay, it does not belong to the order of being and presence, but of hope and expectation. It doesn't belong to the order of being means it's not the height of being, and it's also not the depth of being. The panentheism for me is penultimate. It's the next to the last step. It's because it's still got its footing in being, in the ground of being. So I move from the height of being, God on high, to the ground of being, and I regard that as a necessary step, historically and structurally, as a way of argumentation. I regard panentheism as a necessary intermediate step. We move from the highest being to the depths of being to what is beyond being, or otherwise than being, or being otherwise. Okay? So the questioner is right. You haven't settled things by moving from height to depth. You have to keep going. And then you would say, then you would quote Exodus 3:14 to mean not I am who am, which is probably not what it meant, but I will be who I will be, okay, as Richard Carney works out in The God Who Made It. I am this promise. I am the promise. I will be faithful to you if you are faithful to me. It's a promise. I am who am. It's not a declaration of ipsum esse per se subsistens, as it is in Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so that question actually lets me get a lot on the floor to start this off. So let's go from there.
Yes, thank you. And does anybody want to reply? Questions for clarification or any other questions? And keep in mind that don't be intimidated here, right? There's no stupid questions. If you just like, I don't know what ins esse means or anything like that, ask, okay? There are no stupid questions here. This is for your benefit. If you don't know, now you got a chance to ask. Mbangi, I'm going to let you go first, and then Yaku, I'll let you go second.
Thank you, Justin. My foundation question is, I regard Mr. Caputo as both a philosopher and a theologian. For me to understand his work much deeply, I'd like to find out how do these two disciplines complement each other? What contributions do they do they have towards each other?
I think there are two different ways of doing the same thing. I don't think they have a rigorous disciplinary distinction the way it's enforced by the church on the one hand and by the university on the other hand. The universities don't want to have anything to do with theology, and a lot of the theologians are wary of universities. They're very different disciplines, and I think they are exactly the same thing, pursued differently. Mostly it's a difference in the books you're reading and the conferences you attend. I think both of them are versions of radical thinking. Philosophy is radical thinking, but I think theology is radical thinking. Philosophy is radical thinking, which is not afraid of running into theological ground, not afraid of hitting theological ground, not stampeded by the word theology. It's radical thinking. Theology is radical thinking that's not afraid of the radical part. It's not afraid that it's going to end up saying something unorthodox. It's not afraid of orthodoxy. It's not intimidated by orthodoxy, and it does not accept any authority other than what Husserl called the things themselves. It's the subject matter of thought, as Heidegger put it, the Sache, he called it. So I think theologians and philosophers are ultimately doing the same thing. And that if you begin from the same, so that the distinction between faith and reason, or between religious and secular, ultimately breaks down for me. I don't think there's a radical difference. That means I don't think revelation is a supernatural event, an inbreaking from some higher order. What I think revelation means insight. I think the distinction between reason and faith is really the distinction between prose and poetry. The kingdom of God is not a supernatural revelation that dropped out of the sky that nobody knew about until it was revealed. It's a poetic vision of reality, but it's one which focuses on God. So I call it a theopoetic vision. It's not rational the way a poem is not rational. It's not to say it's not rational is not to say that it's supernatural or that it's irrational. It's to say you don't get it if all you've got are concepts, propositions, and arguments. You only get it if you've got a poet like Jesus who poetizes the kingdom of God. And if you ask him what he means, if you ask Jesus what he means by God, he says the kingdom of God. And if you ask him what he means by the kingdom of God, he says, have you ever seen a mustard seed? He goes to poetry. It's a theopoetic vision. So the faith-reason distinction is not a natural, supernatural distinction. The new theology back in the beginning of the 20th century, Henri de Lubac, when he challenged the notion of the supernatural, he said something like that. Supernatural doesn't mean, Thomas Aquinas didn't think there was nature here and supernature up there. He thought human beings are constituted by the love of God. And I would say that's right. That's where we are, by what is going on in the name of God. So I think philosophers and theologians, if the philosophers keep on philosophizing and the theologians keep on theologizing, they'll meet. And they'll meet in what you might call the mysterium tremendum, the depths of reality, the mystery of being. Heidegger calls it the mystery of being. They're both versions of the openness to being, openness to the mystery, if they have the nerve to radicalize their thinking, which for philosophers means dare. The motto of the philosophers is dare to think, right? Dare to think without, and don't be afraid of running into theological matters, because that's where their daring stops. As soon as they hear the word theology, they cup their ears. Dare to think and keep on thinking. And same thing goes for the theologians. Dare to think and don't be afraid of hitting radical ground, because you're liable to end up saying something unorthodox. No such thing as orthodoxy in matters this deep. Nobody has the authority to claim that they've got it right, which is what the word literally means, when it comes to matters this mysterious.
Mbogoseni, do you want to reply, or is that cool?
No, I've got my response. Thank you.
All right, sharp. Jaco, thank you for waiting patiently. The floor is yours, mate.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Jack, for that wonderfully succinct but clear overview of your journey that you had in your first presentation there. And I want to add on to that, or just attach a question to that. But now your second response also was so exciting, I perhaps want to connect it there as well. Anyways, so you made the mention of that necessary move from perhaps actuality, a conception of God, of actuality, of supreme act, to potentiality. And you also made reference at some stage from the move from being to process. And that I pricked my ears there, because of late I'm kind of interested in the process, philosophical process, theological movement, specifically also with the thought of Whitehead now. So my question really pertains to that. If we conceive of God, of the divine as potential and love, how can you make a connection with perhaps Whitehead's thought of, but because Whitehead had this dipolar concept of God's primordial nature and then God's consequent nature, which collects in a way everything again. But how can one connect that notion of the potential, of the possibility of the impossible, or is there a disconnect with Whitehead's consequent nature? And then just very briefly, the question of supernaturalism, and I connect that with another process theologian, David Ray Griffin, who speaks of naturalistic theism or theistic naturalism. Would you be comfortable with such a kind of, to express your own approach as naturalistic?
Well, you're right. This is a sort of, you might call it a kissing cousin of Whitehead. It's a very closely related chain of thought. I mean, the person in whom you'll see that really clearly is Catherine Keller. Her work is, of all of the process theologians, she's the most literate about postmodern theory, about Deleuze and Derrida, and you see that in her palpably. So she can really make Whitehead dance. But she speaks of having to, how does she put it? I think she says something like darken Whitehead with postmodern theory, or darken Whitehead with Deleuze, or darken Whitehead with Derrida, something like that. Meaning, in Whitehead you have a fairly powerful, rational, systematic, and classical metaphysical theory, whereas my way of thinking about process is more open-ended and less rule-governed and less. This is less metaphysical. I mean, one thing that interests me, and if you're interested in Whitehead and process theology, is what you would do with what contemporary physicists are telling us right now about the cosmos, which is very likely, this is the dominant view, it's not the only view, but the dominant view is that the universe is expanding into oblivion. It's basically burning out. It is not an inexhaustible infinite energy. It is an energy that's consuming itself. And the prospect for the universe, at least ours anyway, most likely is oblivion, just simply spent energy, dark, cold, lifeless, inert, unusable, spent energy. Now, if you want to identify God with the cosmos and the process, cosmic process, God's in for a certain amount of trouble down the road. The universe is heading for oblivion. That's why I don't think the name of God actually ultimately is bound up with cosmic history. I think there's something unconditional in the name of God, and it can't be held captive by being, either by the supreme being or cosmic being, the ground being. It's another kind of unconditionality. I think it's the unconditionality of all of hope and expectation. As David Griffin calls it, naturalistic supernaturalism. Is that what you said?
He calls it a theistic naturalism or a naturalistic theism. I can't remember which way around.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to make as much trouble as I can for the word theism in the name of panentheism. But I mean, in as much as I don't think there is a genuine nature-supernature distinction, I don't think there's a genuine matter-spirit distinction either. I mean, I think they are pre-Einsteinian. They are notions you might have been able to keep in your head before somebody said E equals MC squared. Right? After that, you've got to give that up. Right? There is, and then I think in the scriptures, they didn't have that kind of two-world view. I mean, the kingdom of God was going to be when Jesus came down on the cloud and set up shop. You know, it was the earth. It was this world. There weren't two worlds. So I don't like the nature, supernature, natural, supernatural, even matter, spirit divide, because I just think there's a single world.
All right, thank you for that. Real quickly, anybody here who's on a cell phone and is using data, would you like to get a question in just in case your data runs out? Okay, if you do, I'm just going to switch screens real quickly, just blurt it out. But I thought that this right here would be something of interest to you, Jack. We have one of our students, well, one of the things I have my students to do is send in questions every single week. That's sort of their assignment. And Lejonolo, sorry, I'm a little mouth dry today. She wrote in something that I thought was very nice, and I thought it might be a good way for us to sort of jump into a relationship between theory and praxis. And maybe that could jump us off into how your work can be lived or be presented in a pastoral or daily life type of paradigm. So, Lejo, do you want me to read it out loud, or do you want to read?
No, you can read it.
Okay.
Thank you.
But if you could throw on your camera just so that Jack can see you. All right. So she says, this is from The Insistence of God here. What stood out in the first part of this reading is whatever I know or believe in now regarding theology, God, or life in general, will not be the same a few months or a year from now. I am open to change and learning something new, and that I could say I apply the perhaps formula in my daily life. Like it is mentioned in the reading, I also used to think that perhaps means the idea presented or conversation has defeated me, and I have no comeback. Now I've realized that growth comes from not knowing, which pushes you further to find more. Defeat would be when I decide to live by someone else's conclusion, not being bothered to research further on the topic at hand. Theology is about continuously questioning and not resting once you find the answer, but wrestling with the answer till it leads you to more questions. My views on philosophy and theology have changed from the previous comment I once made about them sitting and waiting for someone to write something so that they can start to argue about it. This was the old William Desmond comment about everybody in the American Academy is waiting for the next Heidegger so that they can write commentaries on it. If you remember his old joke, he loves that joke. I told it to them. About them sitting, I'm sorry, this is not to say that all philosophers and theologians are open to uncertainty, which pushes them to wanting to know more. They just refuse to hold on to what they know at the present moment as all there is to know. If I were to agree that God exists, it means the question of his existence has been answered, and no further question would make me grow deeper in my faith. I would expect God to at least have behavioral traits of things that exist, which goes back to limiting God. Throughout the reading, I kept getting confused between insistences and insist. At times I understood that God insists meant our experience of God through others continues to give us reason to believe that God is out there somewhere. I asked myself what the point of safe theology is, other than a soothing religion, making it attractive to those who only want comfort from God. Yet they still experience good and bad in their daily lives. How would safe theology solve burning issues if it is always looking for a safe place to hide? If praying is asking for trouble, is God the troublemaker, or is the world already troubled, hence God is calling us? And so I thought that was a pretty awesome assignment. I wanted to mention it to you. And Lejonolo, if you want to add to it, please go right ahead.
I don't want to add anything. Thank you.
That's great. That's very, very good. You've got the you got the spirit of the thing, and you know, I don't want to think of God as somebody out there, right? I want to think of God as this energy or drive or dynamism or movement of hope and expectation, which keeps the future open. So the perhaps is not a negative, indecisive perhaps. It is what Nietzsche calls the dangerous perhaps, because it puts our received wisdom into question and exposes us to something we didn't think possible or could not see coming, which is the event. Now, the way I think about this, for us, when I say us, I mean those of us who found themselves as soon as they came about as conscious beings in a world where the name of God is in play. That's not true of everybody, and there are cultures where things are put differently. But for those of us who have inherited the traditions of the book, the various branches and leaves of the book, of the scriptures, the name of God is magnetic. It's a point of convergence for everything that we desire, everything that we love, everything that we strive for. It's a sort of Nicholas of Cusa was a cardinal, and he was, he was before the days when people would get easily excommunicated for. It was before the Reformation, so you didn't have the Council of Trent with its prowling the streets with its theological guns, looking for heresies. Nicholas Cusa said, instead of saying God is ipsum esse, being itself, how about if we call God ipsum posse? Posse, or he said posse ipsum. Call God possibility itself rather than being itself. So that the actual is a limitation of the possible. The actual is just one way to actualize the infinite possibility, which is God. God is this infinite spring of possibilities, and therefore the seed of hope and expectation. God as not as being, but as may being. Okay. So Richard Carney uses, Rich Carney and Catherine Keller both use Nicholas of Cusa. The world is the unfolding of the possibilities, which we call God. So that means that any stable presence is inherently questionable, right? Because any stable presence, any actual belief, any actual state of affairs is a kind of freezing of the possible. And God is the possible. God is the call. God is the Whitehead says the lure. And the perhaps is not the sign of indecision, but the sign of keeping the actual open to the possible. So I don't want to think of God as something out there. I want to think of God as in here. We God in us, or we in God, as the unfolding possibility, the unfolding actualization of the possible. Literally the explication, which literally means unfolding of the possible. But your question is on the right channel. You're grooving in the right groove with what I'm saying. Yeah, and then that's why I think theology actually is radical thinking. I think the problem with Enlightenment thinking or with pure philosophy is it's afraid of theology. You know, they dare to think, except unless because you're going to mention theology, then they lose their nerve. Theology is radically thinking the possibility of the impossible.
Would you like to respond?
No, thank you. I've been answered.
Gift, would you like to respond? I think you've gone a little dark, but I appreciate you being there. Would you like to ask a question? I thought I saw that you give me a wave or something. Okay. If you do, just blurt it out. Anybody else, you're more than welcome to. I will move to another question that one of our students had. And this right here may require a slight bit of context. All right, so one of the things that we've discussed in our class is, like, you know, the practicality of your work. Oh, we got something here, hold on. I thought I saw some, I thought I heard like a ding for someone's hand. All right, but in the practicality, we've been reading The Insistence of God, and we've been talking about the call. Now, in South Africa, and I'm sure you have, you know, the same problem in America with televangelists, we have a lot of religious charlatanry here. People who say they can raise people from the dead, cure COVID from drinking gasoline, and so forth. And so one of the students had a question I think that you can clarify, and that's on what you mean by the call and its relationship to discernment. And how does the call prevent or invite charlatanry or abuse? How can we decide who is responsibly answering the call? So this opens up to, I think, that your concept of this being a risky business.
That's right. It is risky business. Yeah, I mean, when I not only does this what I'm saying have application, it is application. It is. People say we don't we don't want to hear about a weak God. We need a strong God to help straighten things out. My response to that is, it's not that I'm displacing weakness or strength, or getting or trying to undo strength. I'm saying God is the call to which we should be the response. So I say the existence factor lies on our side, not God's side. God's call, the name of God is the name of a call. It's an insistence to which we should be the response, an insistence where we're expected to supply the existence. So the weakness of God implies the strength that is required of us to make the kingdom of God come true. The kingdom of God is a call to which we should be the response. It's something like what Walter Benjamin says when he's talking about the Messianic age. He says, if you want to talk about the Messiah, and the Messiah is going to save us, he says, then you have to understand we are the Messianic age. We are the ones the dead are waiting for. Now, so then the next question is, if we're to be the response to the call, the next question is the one you posed, Justin, and that is about discerning the call. So the call requires a response, but that means that it requires an interpretation. What is being called for? And for that, we don't have rules, but we do have paradigms. We have models. We have, for example, in the case of Christianity, we have the model of the kingdom of God. Christianity, I think, is all about the kingdom of God, the coming of the kingdom, where our task is to make it come true. And then I think, so then I think it requires a reading of this intuition we are given about God, which goes under the name of Jesus. When I use this word intuition, I'm borrowing from Hegel. Hegel says, it's interesting that when Hegel's talking about Jesus, he says the Enlightenment philosophers, the philosophers of Verstand, conceptual understanding, completely miss it. He says they look at Jesus and they pat him on the head and they say he's a model of bravery. He speaks truth to power. Kant says he's a model of the categorical imperative. And Hegel says, we don't need Jesus for that. We've got Socrates for that. What Jesus is an intuition of the divine being. He's an intuition of God, Emmanuel, of God within us, and we within God. So Jesus is our intuition of the divine being, our insight, which is what he means by Vernunft. He means this insight, and you can see how it works out. So then you follow Jesus, right? And then the guide, the paradigm, is this practice of the returning violence with peace, returning abuse with forgiveness, returning mercilessness with mercy. It's the craziest, wildest thing you've ever seen. It's the topsy-turvy, upside-down world of the New Testament, where the last are first, and hostility is greeted with love, and hatred is answered by love, and violence with compassion. So there's a model for us there, and it's an upside down, what Hegel calls die verkehrte Welt, the inverted world, the upside down world, crazier than Alice in Wonderland, upside down, first or last. Insiders are out, outsiders are in. First or last, the last or first. It's this vision of privileging the least privileged, the least among us. Whenever you did this to the least of mine. And then we have to take it from there. We have to have a practiced phronesis. Aristotle called it phronesis. An ability, something we learn from practice to apply. Where the model, the phronimos, is not a phronimos. He's not a wise man. He's the least among us. He's a publicly executed criminal according to the laws of Rome. He's an outsider, and he's persecuted. So the Christian intuition is of a inverted world where it's folly. Folly. Paul calls it the folly of God, which we need to the discernment to apply. I mean, my problem with the Christian right is they don't read the New Testament very well. They just seem to have found a couple of passages in there that they're about handling snakes and crazy stuff, but they miss the they miss the Beatitudes.
Well, thank you for that. Anybody want to reply or ask a new question? To Boho, hopefully your power's back on. Is there a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thanks, Doc. Good evening, everyone. I just found myself battling on the aspect of the hermeneutics, because I think maybe from what Mbongiseni had asked, the question that immediately came to my mind was, firstly, why philosophy for theology? As one part of my question. And I think in the deconstruction in his steps, I found a whole lot of what partly Hloni has touched on in the insistence of God, on the basis that I understood the answer that that was given in terms of philosophy being radical and theology being equally radical. But at some point, one finds a bit of opposition or an attack to the other discipline from what one can gather. That if one is to compare hermeneutics and exegesis, what would be the difference in terms of the identity of God? And I think, as I was saying, that in his steps, we get to a point where we say, where we read that the what would Jesus do question, when it crops up, it comes in a form of Jesus being the truth. And theologians deliberately ignore the element of the truth, or philosophers are out there to identify which that theologians choose not to bring to the fore. Because I think he made an example about the type of Jesus that would crop up, the stinky Jesus, the trashy Jesus. Would that Jesus be truth enough to be accepted by Christians? And I think I wanted to understand the aspect or the concept of the hermeneutical approach versus the exegesis as from the biblical texts.
Just real quickly, for the people like Yaku and Sister Judy and so forth who are joining us, he's talking about a book that Caputo wrote, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And in that book, he does an exposition on the book called In His Steps, which is where we get the term, what would Jesus do? You can go ahead and answer. I just wanted to clarify for anybody else who's not following.
When you say exegesis, do you mean historical critical exegesis? Or do you mean, you were distinguishing between hermeneutics and exegesis, and I was missing the distinction.
Yes, the historical context.
All right, stop me if I don't have this right, if I don't have your question right. I understand historical critical work to be a necessary propedeutic to interpreting, to appropriating, to responding to what's going on in the New Testament. And I think once you do the historical critical bit, you see, well, these are not eyewitness reports. Who the historical person was behind these stories is lost in the fog of history. But something happened, something decisive happened in the first century, which galvanized a community, which created a body of memories, which were orally transmitted, which eventually got written down, in which something was going on. Something happened there, because there were a lot of exorcists and healers in the first century. But with this one, something happened, and it galvanized. It created there was an event there that which is the wellspring of what we call, what in the second century later on was called Christianity, and then which got swept up into Neoplatonism and became all these doctrines that became the history of Christianity. So the historical critical work is necessary in order to demythologize the New Testament, so that we don't think we've got a literal picture of something that actually happened. What we've got is something like songs of celebration, good news, celebrating something that happened in the order of mercy and compassion and love which is galvanized around this figure now who has no longer the flesh and bones body of Jesus of Nazareth. I like to call him Yeshua. Yeshua, what happened, who Yeshua was, what he said and thought. If you picked him up and propped him down in the middle of the Council of Nicaea, he would have been nonplussed. What? What are these people talking about? Do they mean me? You know? So, well, in a certain sense, he's lost to us. You know, we don't. And he was a point of departure for something that came together in theopoetic form in the New Testament, which represents an insight or an intuition of what we mean when we use the name of God. He is our paradigm. These stories capture an insight into what is going on in the name of God. Now, philosophical hermeneutics is that. Historical critical exegesis is the thing that is the hard work of biblical scholarship, which shows you that this is an historical construction. There were probably 100 other gospels back there, but they got either lost or destroyed on purpose. And in the 2nd century, there were probably 200 different things calling itself Christianity. One of them finally, for various reasons, emerged and got canonized. That's historical critical research. But that's not the end of it. It's like, you know, I was reading one time that there actually was a King Arthur. There was a 8th century or 7th century English warlord named Arthur. And a legend grew up about Arthur. And now what's important is not who that guy was back there in the 8th century, whoever he was. What's important is the story. What's important in the New Testament is not who Yeshua was, it's the story. And that's the proper subject matter of hermeneutics, of philosophical hermeneutics. Scriptural exegesis hermeneutics, which is where the word hermeneutics got established, that's different. That's preliminary, that's necessary. If you don't have it, you'll end up, you know, snake handling. You need it, it's necessary, it's important, because it enables us to demythologize. But then after you demythologize, you got to remythologize for a new time, and a new age, and our own age, our own time, because that's what this is. This is an ongoing dynamic, an ongoing image, an ongoing intuition, which keeps getting redone, reworked, reinvented. Was that your question? I'm not sure that was your question. I mean, that might be just the pre-baked answer I've got to this kind of question, but I'm not sure that was your question.
Taboho, you want to clarify?
Yeah, I think partly we are on par in terms of the two terms and forging some kind of complementary linkage between philosophy and theology. However, if I am to follow up on especially the deconstruction aspect, would be from your theological point of view, do you find theologians, and mainly in the aspect of the church, to be selective in the realities of what is brought about in the book when it comes to deconstructing either the church or Jesus himself, and the reality of not just a slogan of what would Jesus do, but the actual actions in which the type of Jesus that Sheldon portrays to us of a non-capitalist, a poor Jesus Christ, the one that will not be found in Sentin but in Alexander. And in the process of the church, where and why is it that that sort of deconstruction becomes partial and not holistic, especially for us as incoming theologians and men and women that are going into ministry, facing the challenges and the realities of what we face today, ranging from poverty, unemployment, inequalities, injustice, feminism, and a whole lot of other problems that we're facing today. What kind of Jesus does the church or theologians want to portray to the modern day Christians?
Okay, all right. So that was slightly different than the answer I gave you. Yes, I mean he very brilliantly identified a kind of hypocrisy in Christianity, in American Christianity in the middle of the in Central America, in Kansas. Kansas actually was at the time. This is hard to believe. Kansas actually was a progressive state in those days. It's right now, as reactionary as you can get, practically. But in those days, it was progressive. And he said, "Look," he says, "So, I don't get what you're calling Christianity and what I'm reading in this book. This man is the oppressed and despised among men. This is the suffering servant. This is the outcast. This is and the church's obligation here, the church's voice should be on behalf of the least among us, of the outcasts. And when you look at it, what the Christian right that he was describing then, and which we still have with us, only now it's much worse because it's become political. Christian right used to be apolitical. It thought the United States was going to hell in a handbasket, and it just stayed out of it, and it let it go, and it kept itself as a pure and separate community. But then it got political. It got political because of abortion. And got political for two reasons. One was abortion, the other was civil rights. Once the federal government said black kids have to go to school with white kids and white kids have to go to school with black kids, that's when the Christian right got mad, got angry, and got political. Civil rights and abortion. They were the two things that politicized the Christian right. So the Christian right he was talking about was sort of innocuous but negligent. Christian right we're talking about is pernicious. It's odious and pernicious and quite dangerous. It's now a white supremacist movement. And Sheldon was blowing the whistle on the Christian right of his day, and we've got to blow the whistle on the Christian right of today, which is much more dangerous than the one he was dealing with.
If I can just add to the whole, just linking it to your question about deconstruction in there, and the process of ministry. And Jack, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong here. But whenever you apply deconstruction, you apply it where there's a crisis or where there's an issue. If you're a minister, so if you're saying, in an American context, for example, because it's just easier, we don't want to step on anybody's toes. But if you're saying like this is unjust, the first thing you should ask is like, why is it unjust? And whenever you just initially ask those questions, you begin the process. So if you're looking for a ministerial application of the question of what would Jesus deconstruct, you're encountering an event that you find either unjust or it could be more just. And then in the process of asking the questions about like, why is it this way? How could it be better? What is the underlying conditions and so forth? That is where the deconstruction happens in a sense. It's trying to wrap your head around the crisis at hand. Is that fair, Jack?
Indeed.
That's
the thrust of the force of law essay. There it is, force of law essay. The call of justice to deconstruct something is to loosen up the way it's become rigidified and reopen it to its own future, which so the justice emerges by the unloosening of binding constraints. So when the law binds, when the force of law binds justices, the loosening of the mind, which doesn't mean there can't be just laws. I mean, he's not saying there's no such thing as just laws. In fact, that's what he wants is just laws. But he also had, remember, he didn't have an Anglo-Saxon conception of law. So he didn't have a law rule of precedent. When he thought about law, he was thinking about the Napoleonic Code. So he thought of a more open-ended form of interpretation, where the judge, the judiciary, is not bound by the rule of precedent, for better or for worse, right? Yeah,
No.
that's a riskier way to do it. So, which is dangerous, perhaps.
Mbangiseni, you've been patient. Do you have another question, please?
Yes, I've been patient. Sorry to take you back, Jack. In your response to the call question, you touched on the folly of God. In your folly of God writing, you quote Meister Eckhart, who says he prays to God to read of God. In other words, he prays to God to free himself from God. How can one pray to a God he wants to be free from? Where's the logic behind this statement? Can you please explain to me?
That's what the Inquisition wanted to know in the 14th century. It basically cost him his job. Well, he was making a distinction between God and Godhead. So he said, God is the nameable God. The Godhead is the unnameable depths of God, the divine abyss, the mysterium tremendum. And that which was for him the seat of mystical unity. So he thought that our unity with God takes place in a ground, what he called the ground of God, which was a nameless, a namelessness, let's say, where all the clatter and chatter of concepts and propositions and arguments, and of the disputed questions that he was delivering as a Meister. Remember, he held the same chair of theology that Thomas Aquinas held. He was a Dominican, and he held the chair at Paris, the Dominican chair at Paris, which was the most prestigious chair in the Dominican order. So in his own day, he was a famous Harvard professor. He had a prestigious academic chair. He was very good at giving theological arguments and doing what theologians do, but most of that work is lost because his work was condemned. And so most of his Latin writings were lost, and the only things we have are the German sermons. We have some Latin writings, but most of what we have are the German sermons where he's at his most radical. But he was making a distinction between the God whom we can name on the basis of philosophy and theology. That included revelation. See, this is where he's getting in trouble. Anything you would say about God based on reason or revelation would be something we can say. But the God beyond God, the true, who is the depths of God, is nameless. The depths of God are such that our names fall short. They're like arrows aimed at the moon. They drop into the water before they reach the target. So he says, and that's unity with God. Absolute unity with God, which is nameless. So he says he prays to God to let him get there, into that abyss, to admit him, because he can't do it. But if he lets God do it for him, that's the prayer. Let God be within him, utterly, in his ground. So it was It was a beautiful mysticism. But he got in trouble because he was making a distinction between the Deus Revelatus and the Deus Absconditus. And he was saying there's something deeper than revelation.
And Bagasani, do you want to reply or anything?
Yes, thank you for that answer. I'm still trying to figure out what he was really meaning. But on deconstruction, is it correct for me to say that you paint a picture of the church that should have a task of submitting itself to the actual question of deconstruction? In other words, the church as the catalog of Jesus is actually the question, not the answer. Is it correct for me to say that? Thank you.
That the church is the question, not the answer?
Yeah. Yeah. In deconstruction, do you mean that the church itself is the question, not the answer?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, I didn't have to think of putting it that way, but that's a good way to put it. Yeah, the church is the. I mean, the Protestants got something right, and the Catholics got something right. The Protestants got the principle of criticism, that there's always a gap or a distance between the conditions under which we approach God and God. The principle of critical distance. The unconditional will never be adequately expressed in any particular under any particular set of conditions. So semper reformandum. But what the church got right, Catholic Church gets right, is the notion of tradition, the notion of the spirit. That the church is the spirit that moves through time, which is the dynamism, the energy of what happened, the event that happened in the New Testament. And so I call that the Catholic principle. Now, according to the Catholic principle, if the Catholic principle is the principle of the tradition, it means that every given articulation of the truth is an historical construction. And if it's an historical construction, it's deconstructible. So what we tend to call orthodoxy is an historical construction. It was constructed under the aegis of Neoplatonic metaphysics. It had its day, it had certain things to say, but the metaphysical underpinnings of it are Neoplatonism. Jesus didn't know anything about Neoplatonism. The churches, the councils of the church were Greek, Neoplatonic, onto-theologians, formulating a Neoplatonic interpretation of what Jesus called Abba. And the tradition keeps moving. The spirit keeps moving. It moves through that. It doesn't drop it, but it just moves through it. It keeps going. And it passes through its various historical configurations. But there's never any configuration that is the final word. The spirit keeps prompting us anew to. The spirit is the principle of renewal. Tradition is a radical principle. It's a principle of ever ongoing, incessant renewal. So the church's record in this regard is really terrible. Right? It's continually issuing apologies 200 years after the fact about things it got wrong. And it can't keep up with the Spirit. The church is always falling behind the Spirit. The church says, ubi ecclesia ibi spiritus. Should be the other way around. Ubi spiritus ibi ecclesia. And the church's job is to try to keep up with the Spirit. Spirit right now is telling the church all about same-sex love. And the church is not listening. And it's telling about women and the role of women in the church. Church is not listening. It's not listening to the Spirit. The people who have the Spirit are the genuine traditionalists. If you really believe in tradition, you are a very radical person. But you don't accept any present formulation as anything more than provisional, which is why you need the Protestant principle, which is this keep the distance open between any conditional formulation and the unconditional, between any construction and the undeconstructible. So the church just fails to be the church. It fails to be what it's supposed to be about. How it ended up organizing itself according to the principles of Diocletian, which is where it comes from, the Pontificus Maximus and the diocese. That's Diocletian. That's a Roman emperor. That's not the kingdom of God. It's the opposite of the kingdom of God. If Jesus knew that his memory was enshrined in an institution which bore the stamp of a Roman emperor which spoke Latin, talk about weeping over Jerusalem.
Well, thank you for that. That was really good. I've got a few questions here. Fabian says amazing points. His email, I don't think his mic is working too well. Neither is Sister Judy's. And she had a question, and she asked us about the time whenever you were talking about Meister Eckhart. Would you relate mysticism with insights? Insight and intuition.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have to, because I mean, I think the essence of the mystical is the recognition of the incomprehensible or the unencompassable, or the Schelling has a great word for it. He calls it das Unvordenkliche, literally the unprethinkable. It's a great word. Thinking can't get there in time for being. Being is always already in place. And so any attempt to say what being is, Schelling called negative philosophy. Positive philosophy affirms being, pure, unprethinkable being. So the mystical is that. I think the mystical is running up against the mysterium tremens et fascinans. But it takes away from that some way to be, some form of life, some understanding of things, which respects the incomprehensible depths of things. So, yeah, the mystics had a, and particularly someone like Meister Eckhart had a real insight into how to be, and what his takeaway, Meister Eckhart's takeaway, was living without why. One of our he says some people love God the way they love their cow, for its milk, whereas God should be affirmed without why. The love of God is without why. Love is without why. And so there's a whole understanding of life, and, spirituality there. So even though mysticism recognizes the unforeseeable, it still is an insight. It takes away from that a certain understanding of life. So yeah, that's an interesting way to put what mysticism is. It's insight. I mean, normally we say it's the opposite, right? Normally we say we're blinded by the mystery. But it's not merely that. It's actually it's a phenomenology. I think that what I think what both philosophy and theology are I think they're both phenomenologies. I think they're both descriptions of lived experience. And phenomenologies turn on phenomenological intuitions. So yeah, I mean, I never thought of saying it that way, but that's probably right.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Protus, you've been patient. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And I think he's just gone into what I wanted to ask. And I seem to note that John said, you said that, and you give a lot of credit to the mystics. You said the very best thing ever said about God are said by mystics. And I think what you quote is of God, we cannot say a thing. Doesn't this look like some kind of defeatism in your quest to answer that question? By the way, question about saying God is not a supreme being. And for me, that title, one time I came back home with this, I printed it and my wife saw it and he looked at it and said, "What are you reading?" And I said to her, "No, don't worry, it's John Caputo." So that's the why do you think the mystics got it right? Because that's the impression I get from that sentence. And then also just another question: would you mind to just give an insight of the theological atheism, you call it mystical atheism, and John Caputo's atheism? Thank you.
Atheism. You're breaking up a little bit there. Atheism?
I think that, can I try to give translate here, Protus, and you tell me if I got it right? Your first question was, why did he think the mystics got it right? And then your second question is, could he expand upon his concept of atheism?
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, when I say they got it right, I mean there's a downside to the mystics, and that is most of them, and Meister Eckhart is a good example, are Neoplatonists. You know, they ultimately have this notion of an absolute eternal one. So mystical unity for them is becoming one with the one. Now, when you're one with the one, the first thing to do is call the undertaker, right? I mean, that means you're dead. You know, if you requiescat in pace is one with the one. So I'm not a Neoplatonist. I mean, what I call radical theology is an attempt to get theology out of Neoplatonism and make it a hermeneutics of the world. So there's a Neoplatonic metaphysics in the background of the mystics, which I reject. But the form of life, which particularly Meister Eckhart, and now it's turning out Marguerite Porete, because it turns out Eckhart got a fair amount of this stuff. I didn't realize this years ago. He got a fair amount of this stuff from a Frauenmystik, Marguerite Porete. She really was the one who came up with the without why thing. And I think if I were a wise man in the mountain and people came up to visit me and they said, "What is the meaning of life?" I would say life is without why. You know, it is intrinsically to be cherished. Period. It's not for something. It's my strategy says, if you ask life, "Why do you live?" life would say, if it could speak, "I live because I live." Life is cherished for itself. And so means ends rationality is a way of destroying life, of distorting life. Okay. Now, so I think and then when they get to God, they recognize that what we're talking about is ultimately incomprehensible mystery. Now, whether that we should call that incomprehensible mystery God or the world, you could argue about that. As to my atheism is always a function of whatever theism you had in mind, right? It's relative to the theism of which it is being atheistic. And so my atheism is like Tillich's. When Tillich describes the sort of classical Orthodox idea of God as a being, supreme being, whose existence you could argue about, he says the right religious and theological response to that is atheism. That I'm against. That does not exist. Which is not the end of theology, it's the beginning. That's where theology starts. So my atheism is the beginning of radical theology, which the first step of which is to say, God is not a supreme somebody with whom I talk. He is. I mean, I talk to God the way I talk to my favorite tree or an old clock that has been handed down over the ages in my family. We personify the things we love, right? So we personify God. That's important. That's not nothing. It's not imaginary. It's not fiction. It's important, but it's not literally true. It's a personification. So recognizing the personification is a personification is my atheism. It's not the end of God, it's the beginning. And what I put in its place with Tillich is that God is not a supreme being, God is that in which we live and move and have our being. But then I take another step and I say that's not the ground of being either, that's the event. But my atheism is the first step in establishing radical theology. So it's not a sort of God is dead, anything goes atheism. It's not naturalistic reductionism. It's a theological, religious atheism. That's a good.
Okay,
yeah, that's a helpful thing to get on the board, actually, to get on the table. That point.
Well, thank you, Protus. We're coming up to the basic end. I was imagining that this would be about a 90-minute thing. I don't want to take Jack for too long. So go ahead and get your questions in the back of your mind. I'm going to give Benny's question, which he typed out, and then we'll do a final round, okay? But Benny asks, in our journey of personal reflection of God within us, taking into account the sin that mankind always wrestles with, in terms of deconstruction, is it safe to say that deconstruction can also be a personal encounter with Jesus Christ in order for change to happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, there would be a personal experience of what's being asked of us when we read these stories and follow these parables and listen to these sayings in the New Testament. If that's what you mean by a personal experience of Jesus Christ. I mean, the problem with that language is that to me, it sounds like fundamentalism. But if what you mean is a personal encounter, which is life transforming, with what we're being asked to do by the New Testament, yeah, then deconstruction is a sort of implicit theology because it's a critique of idolatry. It's saying that it's like the critique of the law in the name of justice. It's got its eye on the thing that's being left out by the law. It heals on the Sabbath. Deconstruction heals on the Sabbath, and that's the law. That's the That's why I like to call the New Testament sacred anarchy. It heals the withered arm on the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So yeah, if you take away something like that, and you want to call that a personal experience of Jesus Christ. I mean, I was one time speaking at a very conservative college, and the student said to me, she said, "Well, I'm hearing what you're saying, but she says my life was changed one afternoon in June 2 years ago by a personal experience of Jesus Christ." I said, "Well, I think something actually happened to you there, but I wouldn't literalize that. And you could sort of express it that way, but I wouldn't literalize that."
Okay, I have one written question, but if anybody wants to pop in with another question. I'm sorry, Jakob?
Justin, yes, thank you. I don't want to take away from these students, but can't help myself. Towards the end of the discussion, I'm really just interested, Jack. We are located here in South Africa, right? So Southern Hemisphere, in a way, part of the global South to some extent, and we're trying to theorize and understand and to interpret our own situation and our world also from this perspective. And I think we've recently started taking this much more seriously. Is there anything that you would say to us here in the global South in terms of our doing of philosophy? Is there, in terms of perhaps, power relations or whatever, decolonizing theology, is there anything that you would say to us from your perspective?
Well, I don't want to be presumptuous, having never visited South Africa and knowing only about it by reading about it. But it seems to me the scene, one of several around the globe, of liberation theology. It's the place where liberation theology is called for and calls for action. And I see I see deconstruction as a version of liberation theology. I see it as the wonderful force of law essay of Derrida is about the undeconstructibility of justice. I mean, I see deconstruction as a kind of implicit theology, and theology as a kind of implicit deconstruction. And I think that the place where those two things come together is liberation theology. And I think that we need a liberation, and I'm sure you've got it. That's why I don't want to be presumptuous. A liberation theology for South Africa. I mean, the fundamental call of the New Testament is to, when did you see me hungry and thirsty, and give me to eat and to drink? Period. That's theopoetics is theopraxis, and that's its most fundamental emancipatory power. It puts the sign of God on the oppressed. That's what the kingdom means. The kingdom of God I take to be almost an ironic mockery of the Imperium Romanum. It said the real imperium is not of the high and mighty, it is of the least among us. And that seems to me the essence of the prophets and the essence of the New Testament and the essence of liberation theology, of which South Africa is the ongoing actualization and realization, the task. So I doubt that I have anything to add that you don't already know.
No, thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, perhaps it's time for you to come and visit then, once everybody gets their vaccines.
Well, I'm 80 years old now. I don't know how much more flying I'm going to do, but it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this invitation. I do appreciate the chance to talk to you. I know Richard, my good friend Richard Carney, has been there and made a good impression on you all. And anything he said by way of criticizing me, that's the only thing he ever gets wrong. You can believe everything Richard says except when he criticizes me. Or Derrida.
Yeah.
You got the recurs. You got an ersatz recur and an ersatz Derrida there with me and Richard. But I just finished reading did a review of Richard's work, and I did a review of all of his stuff in South Africa and all the wonderful things you did together. So that was fun to do. But just don't believe what he says about Derrida.
Yeah. Yaku, you were a part of that book, weren't you?
Which one was that, Justin? Just
the Richard Kearney book that Donnie Veltzman put together.
I wasn't part of it now, but I was part of the panel that had that discussion with Richard when he was here. But I didn't partake in that book. No.
Well, I've got one last question from a student of ours, poor Sheldon. He's stuck in Potchefstroom with no power at the moment, so hopefully he has a gas stove. But he wanted me to ask a question here for you. Let me just put it on present so that you don't have to hear my dyslexic reading. And then I'll have one final, very, very simple question. All right, you guys should be able to see. All right, you only have to answer the first part, I think. Based on the view you take regarding deconstruction, where are we constantly praying for something that has already happened, but is always arriving? Would you describe this view in how would you describe this view in light of liberation theology, assuming that we have the same liberation theology? So this question actually flows into Yaku's. In chapter 3 of your book of What Would Jesus Deconstruct, you begin with a distinction of events and give two. I refer to one in my previous question, the first being something that has already happened but is still arriving, and the second being the name in which events are expressed. Considering the event of the kingdom of God here on earth, could this event be seen in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Samaritan traveler loves and cares for a wounded stranger, where the Samaritan loves his neighbor as himself? So he really wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, I think we've done a pretty good job of answering that question in advance. That's the answer to all that is pretty much yes, indeed. One thing, I think I'm right about this. If there are biblical New Testament scholars out there, maybe they can correct me, but I think I recall reading that the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is one of the most beloved of all, is not found in any manuscript before the 7th or 8th century. And they think it's probably was added by some copyist along the way, in which case it's not authentic. I think that's true. But the New Testament people, I like to read the New Testament stuff because I love it. But I don't do it. I'm not a frontline New Testament scholar by a long shot. But I'm very, very, very interested in it. I think I remembered reading. The Good Samaritan is probably the addition of a copyist. Nobody ever refers to it. I don't think Augustine ever refers to it. That would be a tip-off.
I recall hearing that too. Remember, I went to UNC and got my my New Testament from Bart Ehrman, so he was really quick to point out anything like that. So I think I remember hearing it too.
There's the guy that would know the answer to that question. That may even be where I read it. Okay, so you had one more.
Yeah, it's a really simple question. I like to ask anybody who comes and joins. What have you been reading? Has there been anything that you've read or watched, or some type of art or theology that's really struck you recently?
I've been doing a lot of writing and working on my own stuff. But the things that I've been reading lately, I am fascinated by what's going on in artificial intelligence theory, and which I really think is, talk about the future of theology, that I believe is the future of theology. Theology is going to have to come to serious grips with what's going on in artificial intelligence theory. And I'm also very deeply interested in what physicists are telling us about the universe. talking about the mystics, I think the physicists are the new mystics. I mean, these people working on quantum theory and the astrophysicists working on the ultimate destiny of the universe. I think they're the new mystics. So I've been reading a number of things by this man named Carlo Rovelli, who is an Italian physicist who writes, you know, the way I will try to write something in a more popular vein, which is what they're doing at the AAR, but you know, it's important, and I'd like people sort of a broader audience to know it, like The Folly of God was like that, or On Religion was like that. Well, Carlo Rovelli does that with quantum physics, and or with physics in general, astrophysics and quantum physics, and he's brilliant. So I'm reading a thing right now. He wrote a thing called 7 Short Lessons in Physics, which is just brilliant. And right now I'm reading a book which sounds like it was written by a philosopher. Reality is not what it seems. And so when I get a chance to read something else, that's the kind of things I've been reading lately.
All right. Well, thank you. Everybody, say thanks to Jack here for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate the exchange. I appreciate the time you spent and the questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so thank you guys for the great questions and everything. Keep in touch with the WhatsApp group if you have any follow-ups or anything like that. Fantastic showing. I really appreciate it. I'll upload the loading and the recording in the future. And thank you, Sister Judy and Yaku, for helping me get all this stuff together and off the ground. All right.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for making this possible.
Thanks, Justin.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jimmy.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.